welcome to My Tiny Bottles, the project where I explore my grandmother's legacy of miniature liquor bottles, one tiny bottle at a time. I'm your host, Tammy Coxon, and I'm sitting here in Scotland with not one guest, but two, pretty exciting, to taste another bottle of Scotch whiskey. So I have Neill Murphy, who you may remember from my episode on Black Bottle Scotch whiskey. Welcome back, Neill.
Thank you. Yeah.
Give the viewers just a little reminder about who you are.
Yeah, so my name's Neill Murphy. I'm based here in Glasgow. I'm born and raised here, and I write a whiskey blog called whiskyreviews.net. I've been doing that since around 2015.
Awesome. Welcome. And I also have Mark Meenan. So Mark doesn't have any whiskey credentials, so to speak, although I think he has drunk rather a lot of it in his time.
One or two years.
Yes. And I know Mark through our both of us working on the Glasgow 2024 World Science Fiction Convention, which is actually what brought me to Scotland. And one of the things I always appreciate about Mark is that he's always got a flask at the ready for me with something interesting in it at our meeting. So I thought he would appreciate getting to taste this bottle of VAT 69 blended finest Scotch whiskey, which is going to be from around the same time period, I think, as the Black Bottle Scotch. So somewhere in the late 1970s, before things went metric and before the proof labeling changed. So late 70s, 76, 79, somewhere in there. So VAT 69, what do you guys know about it?
Well, the popularity predates my time. I remember it being around in the 70s, but I was probably a little young to be a regular drinker at the time, shall we say. So I do remember my grandparents having VAT 69, and it had been on TV.
Okay. How about you?
Much the same, really. It's a name I've always known, but it doesn't really appear much on our shelves anymore. It's still produced, but I think most of it goes to export markets now, so we don't actually see a lot of it in Scotland. But the name's always been there. You know, you've always heard it mentioned and talked about. And it seems to have quite a long kind of history, you know, quite an interesting.
Yeah, I think it is one of the scotches that sort of has had the most media coverage, right? So it was in Band of Brothers, it was in Yes Minister.
Yes Minister, it was mentioned, it was jokes on it.
As jokes, right. So it is something that's kind of been in the background for people. And I know that part of the other reason that I know this came from the 1970s is that they were bought in the 1980s. And so the bottle changes very dramatically in the 1980s. Probably the liquid in it changed as well. But I haven't tasted any modern VAT 69. Either of you tasted it in recent times?
Not recently anyway, no.
All right, so we just get to transport ourselves back in time.
Sounds good.
Any predictions before we crack this baby open?
It's hard not really knowing it. It was considered a deluxe whiskey in the 70s, so it should be quite nice. Deluxe whiskies were better at that point, I think, just because of the nature of the market. It tended to have a lot more malt in it than grain.
Right, we talked about that with Black Bottle Scotch, that it, at the time there wasn't the demand for single malts that there is today, so more of those could end up in the bottles, and also they weren't trying to meet so much demand, so they could have older bottles, older barrels in there too. Yeah,
and I think we were very not so much surprised, but I thought the Black Bottle was very nice. So my hopes for this are maybe elevated a little because of that, you know. So
we're promising something now.
We've got ourselves all worked up. Here we go. All right, so that is the fun of doing these things live. Took quite a bit of struggling off camera to get this thing to open, but it finally did. So here we go. Now we can finally, even just opening the bottle, I can smell it already. That's, I think I warmed it up with my hands on it, trying to get it open. All right. I always got to save a little so we can go back for second round. So you're looking at the legs like you would with
even
wine.
even just the colour. Actually, it's quite a light
It
colour.
is
You
very
know,
light.
a lot of blends nowadays they put a touch of artificial colouring in
Sure.
to give them a kind of darker, richer appearance. You know, this
Never mind
looks
the
like
blends,
it's
some
like
of the
even the malts.
malts,
Yeah, but this looks quite a natural colour to me. That's what jumps out at me straight away.
Not nearly as aromatic as the Black Bottle was. I mostly get sort of a peat on the nose. I'm like, oh, this is definitely gonna have some of that ashy peaty kind of way about it.
There is a smoke. That's surprising. I wasn't expecting much smoke, but there is something there.
Mm-hmm.
There's also, I'm getting a kind of fresh fruit sort of thing as well.
Which kind of fruit?
Like
Apples, pears?
yes, like apples, pears, even a touch of lemon maybe.
Got a more sensitive nose than I do, finding lemon in here.
Mm-hmm.
You got any aroma notes for us, Mark?
Aroma notes. I don't have the same words you do, I think, but I would say there isn't much there.
No,
You'd expect
quite
it to be
light.
more, quite light.
Yeah.
Really
smell
not a lot
wise.
of nose.
Quite delicate.
And I mean, we know this with wine, that some wines, like Chardonnay, for instance, isn't always very aromatic, whereas Sauvignon Blanc is always going to kind of hit you in the face with aroma. But that doesn't mean they're not both delicious. They just kind of have different experiences on that level. I'm going to taste. That is not my Scotch. That is not the Scotch that I would be like, ooh, I love that. But I know people who probably it would be.
Mm. It's not without its charms, actually. It's got a lightness, especially almost sort of effervescence on the palate, I find. Like it sort of evaporates off the tongue. Very light, very delicate. A little kind of fudgy, maybe.
Yeah.
Butterscotch kind of flavours. Don't really pick up the smoke so much on the palate. I could feel it pick it up on the nose a little, but not so much when tasting.
It definitely is much more aromatic. Like now that I've got it in my mouth and I'm sort of breathing in and breathing out, I mean, it's persisting on my tongue quite a long time. It's got that Scotch bite, but it's not harsh, I wouldn't say. But you're right, very light.
Yeah, I would have said that very smooth, really. The smooth and liquid, but there is that harshness, bite in the mouth,
yes,
not in the throat.
Right. That's exactly it, right? Yeah, my mouth is hot, but my throat is not burning.
Yeah.
It's a really good way to put it.
I'd say
there is a sweetness to it.
Yes, it's a kind of summer whiskey, I think.
Yeah.
It's quite light.
Sure.
It's almost like, the barley blowing in the breeze kind of thing. It's like the summer barley fields. It's that sort of, you can sort of smell the grains, I think, in it.
Yeah, it's not the one I would pick.
No, it's if it was there, I would drink it. But not that's necessarily saying very much. But it's not the one I would pick.
Yeah, I think the Black Bottle that we tried in a previous video was more to my taste.
Mm-hmm.
But again, I in the right circumstances, I could enjoy that.
I think your point about this being a summer whiskey, if it was hot outside, and you don't want to drink something that's really heavy, this actually has that lightness, that effervescence that you described.
Yeah. And you wouldn't do it with an old bottle, but nowadays people are much more adventurous about drinking whiskey in cocktails or as long drinks.
Yeah.
This would make a good highball, I think. This
right,
with soda water in the summer. Absolutely.
And that drink was incredibly popular in the United States. I mean, for a long time, it was the way that people drank Scotch. It was one of the reasons that Scotch was so popular in the 70s. I mean, people were drinking it as these long drinks. That first starts in the late 1800s when golf becomes a thing, and people drink Scotch and sodas when they go golfing. And then it kind of comes back in the 70s, post-war period, when people are just mixing really easy drinks at home. And now it's back again, courtesy of the Japanese highball, bringing Scotch and soda back to our perception.
One of the things to say is that in the 70s, in my experience, which is again of my parents' generation, is that quite often it's whiskey and ginger ale. So the same sort of idea.
Yeah,
That something like that would be fine, and this would give that sweetness to it.
Oh yeah, actually that would go really well with ginger ale.
Absolutely, a lovely thing, yeah.
Yeah. So VAT 69 is called VAT 69 because the guy who made it, and I can't remember his name right now, he'd sort of done a bunch of tests, and he had a bunch of different barrels, and then he invited his friends, this is the story I know, to taste them, and everybody picked VAT 69 as their favorite.
I believe so, yeah. So quite often when you're making a blend, obviously you will have, I think there could be as many as 40 different whiskies in this recipe. There will be at least a couple of grain whiskies, and then, there could be 35 different malt whiskies in there. And quite often when they're making blends, what they'll do is they'll put it all together and then put it back into a cask, because it marries a little and mellows out, and they all join together. So apparently it was William Sanderson who founded the blend, and he made apparently 100, so he had 100 casks, and each of them was stamped VAT 1, VAT 2, VAT 3, all the way up to 100. He invited a group of experts to sample them all, and VAT 69 was the winner. And apparently even the sort of stenciled logo is what was stenciled on the cask, so that's where the logo actually comes from. Yeah. Interesting stuff, anyway.
Yeah.
I unfortunately didn't have a modern version of VAT 69 to try. As I say, we don't really see it much in this country anymore. Right. But what I do have is something kind of similar. So this is a 12-year-old blended Scotch whisky. So it's the same thing. It has lots of malt whiskies in there and some grain whiskies in there. But as we talked about with the VAT 69, where they blend it and put it back in cask, this was blended and then put back in a cask and then sort of forgotten about. And then an independent bottler came along and bought that cask and has bottled it themselves.
Oh, so it's like one of those forgotten casks.
Basically, yeah, it was left aside and never went into the product it was meant to go into. Somebody else has come along and snapped it up and bottled it themselves. So we don't really know what's in there, obviously. We don't know what product it was originally intended for, but it is a blended Scotch. It is bottled slightly higher, though this is 50%, so may have a bit more of a kick to it. But yeah, I think this is really interesting. And sorry, carry on.
I was going to say, is that higher proof? When we see the old bottles, they're all at 40%. So is this higher proof something that is modern, trendy? Are people bottling things at higher proofs now, and what's behind that?
I think so. I think people are like flavour junkies now. People want to chase really interesting flavours, bold flavours. And generally, when you bottle at a higher flavour, it's the alcohol that gives it the flavour, really. All the flavour compounds are in the alcohol.
It's the water.
It's water, yeah. So the higher the percentage, the more alcohol, the argument would be, the more flavour. But in whiskey, there's a particular interesting area where once it's bottled at 46% or above, you don't need to do a process which is called chill filtering.
Okay. Mark, what do you got going on here?
As it goes on, I can the nose is getting more, and I think it just needs a bit more warmth to get that there. That's what I'm doing here.
That's what I was thinking too. I was like, I want more here. I'm just not getting much, but and I had
it's coming. You could from when I was first poured to there, and then it just get warmed a bit more, and then it'll be. And
I had exactly that same instinct. I'm going to clutch this, and then I looked over, and you were already doing it, so I felt completely justified.
But it's quite unusual to be able to taste something like this. There's not a lot of this around, It's quite unusual to taste a blend similar to this, but at higher strength, because usually they're diluted down for the mass market,
No shortage of flavor in that. The nose might not be huge at this point, but there's definitely a lot of flavor going on. I don't even know how to describe this one. You talked about lemon on this, and there's almost something like that. There's like a brightness to this.
I would say there's a citrusy thing to it, definitely, I get a slight oakiness as well.
Warmth can do it.
Well, and the higher proof is definitely contributing to that.
That does contribute to that, but it wasn't there right away.
Probably put this one in the phrase.
Sorry.
That's what we're drinking.
Again, I think it just has much more fullness of flavour to it.
If this was a true independent bottler was somebody that's really thought about the flavour and the combinations. I would imagine, it's not a mass market one like
Exactly.
69.
Exactly.
Right. And you say they just sort of found this.
As far as I'm
they
aware,
go and they look for old barrels that have been abandoned, taste them, and say, "Oh, this one's interesting," and they want to bottle it.
I think sometimes they taste them, sometimes they don't get the chance to. Whiskey's in so much demand now that sometimes the independent bottlers don't get the chance to taste them. But if they know their stuff and they maybe know where the cask came from, know what company it came from to begin with, and they think, "Oh, and blend, that's interesting. You don't see that very often." Then it's worth picking up. Even if it turns out not to be the best whiskey in the world, it's a bit of a curiosity.
So for podcast listeners, because this also will go out as a podcast, so what we are tasting is the Independent Selection Blended Scotch Whiskey, aged 12 years, bottled February 2023 this year from a single butt. So I assume that's a single barrel.
Sherry butt, yeah.
A sherry butt. So
yes.
Are those bigger than...
They are 500 litres, I believe, yes.
Okay,
they
so
are
bigger than an oak cask.
A barrel's about 250, I think.
So
Did you ever try the Black Bottle?
No, I've not had that pleasure, unfortunately.
I remember when it was the first discovered. These were barrels, supposedly, at least. They were discovered in the Bowmore distillery in an area they hadn't thought they were, and they were stored below seawater.
That's right, yeah.
And it was a really, really dark whiskey, and it was really nice. And this was the 90s when you got them for something like £25 a bottle, whereas now it would have been
remortgaging your house.
Your house to get them, even though they were 20 years old or something like that at that point.
I'm going to say to my taste, I am enjoying this more with a little bit of water. I'm getting a lot more out of it.
Yeah,
I'll try that.
Yeah. It's always a good idea, I think. I would always recommend people taste neat to begin with.
Yeah.
To get the full experience, but then add some water, add a wee bit more if necessary.
Yeah, I get peat now that I didn't get at all the first time. And I get caramel notes, which I didn't really get at all the first time.
Okay. I'll try it.
Right, you guys could have entirely different experiences from me, right? This is all subjective. There are no right answers.
Absolutely. That's the thing with tasting notes. You can't possibly be wrong, because we all taste what we taste, We all have our own memories to draw from, and that's where the tasting notes come from,
Well, thank you for bringing this really interesting bottle. And thank you for joining me.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Neil, where can people find you?
I am on my blog is whiskyreviews.net, and you can get me on Facebook and Whiskey Reviews page, on Instagram at Whiskey Neil, or Twitter at Neill Murphy, and that's Neil with double L.
Mark, do you have any social media you would like to plug?
Not particularly, no. Apart from Glasgow 2024.
I was going to say people should definitely check out Glasgow 2024.
If you're into your science fiction, come to Glasgow next year in August for the World Science Fiction Convention.
That's right, and you can drink whiskey too.
Yes.
All right, Slanjava.
Slanjava.